to see it as a positive is that it's been a very good opportunity to study a lot of things. I'm now in the fourth and final year of our study of Madhyamaka, middle way philosophy. Our first 2 years were wonderful, a lot of debate. But then last year, it was wonderful in a different way when I was stuck in Nepal for the entire year. So I had to do as best as I could to study the texts of Madhyamaka while I was in Nepal. Very fortunately, the only text I had brought with me, because I thought I was just going to do a retreat there, was Nagarjuna's Sixfold Collection of Reasoning. So I was able to go through that quite extensively during that year, and then read some texts online. And then I returned to Sarah at the end of the year, and have been here since then. So we had about one very fortunate month to debate again at the beginning of this year in March, and we've been in lockdown. But since we're at home and we have a very extensive library, fortunately in our house, it's been a very good opportunity to study a lot. So I've been continuing to study Nagarjuna's texts, and very happy to be able to have the opportunity to teach some of them, because it forces me to think about it more. This is why we debate. When you talk about things and try to explain it, then you can see if you really understand it or not. So in lieu of that, having the opportunity to teach is very fortunate for me, and I hope for others as well. There's some benefit. So maybe, Shanti, we can start with the prayers. Just do a few opening prayers before the first session. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, perfectly awakened being, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the complete and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror from the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate and make offerings and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When you, O supreme amongst humans, were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides, then said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I prostrate. With pure bodies, forms supremely pure, wisdom motion like a golden mountain, fame that places in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not. Incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you the one gone to thusness I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path of sublime pure reality, Through the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. To those who are liberated and also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three effort devout homage. To all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all the realm's atoms and all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a lamp, flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the profound perfection of the categories of the phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld the five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom, should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding the five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. No visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element and so on, up to and including no mind element, and no element of, where are we? Of mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell on the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awake and do unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Dayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi soham. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, it is like that. Son of lineage, it is like that. It is like that one should practice to the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated, even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, Gandharvas, are overjoyed and highly praised that thought spoken by the Bhagavan. Okay, we'll recite the mantra one time again. Tayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi soha. Okay, so, and then we do the mandala.
This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. O holy and perfect pure Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayam.
And we'll actually we'll recite the refuge in bodhicitta 3 times. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha and know the benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha and know the benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha and know the benefit all sentient beings. Okay. And now let's just pause. We can sit quietly for a couple minutes just to get centered and present. Okay. Again, welcome everybody. So before I begin the open the presentation. Just mention, we just recited the Heart Sutra, which is very appropriate in this context. So I think a lot of you probably know this and recite the Heart Sutra fairly regularly, maybe every Hamilton teachings you recite. So some of you may know that when we say the Heart Sutra, in the heart here, it means the essence of, right? It's the most condensed of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Actually, not the most condensed, but the most condensed one that's comprehensible to read. And so the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras is an entire class of sutras that includes especially what we call the extensive, middling, and condensed Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which are the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 100,000 verses, which fills 13 volumes of Tibetan text, and then 25,000 verses, which fills 3 volumes, and in 8,000 verses, which is a 1-volume text, 1 volume being about 1,000 pages in Tibetan. And these texts form the most important basis of our study program here at Sera. So Shanti may have mentioned here in the Geshe Studies program, which can last from between 19 to 25 years of study. And of that time, our first 3 years are spent in general preparation, learning how to debate, learning the basic fundamentals of Buddhist philosophy. Then we spend 7 years studying Perfection of Wisdom, as we call it, but really it means approaching the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras from the point of view of the path that one follows. And then we spend 4 years studying Madhyamaka philosophy, which, although it's not called Perfection of Wisdom, is also a way of studying the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, except rather than approaching it from the point of view of the path, it approaches it from the point of view of wisdom, the object of the path, emptiness. Then we spend some years studying monastic discipline, which will start next year for me, and then a couple of years studying Abhidharma. So 11 years, really the most important part of our program, is all about the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And when we say Perfection of Wisdom, it's understood actually it mean 4 different things. So Perfection of Wisdom can mean the path perfection, which is the path leading to enlightenment, which involves, of course, many of you know bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, and many other kinds of mental states that one cultivates, kinds of meditation. This is, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, this is understood to have been taught implicitly. It's not explicitly taught, doesn't specifically say in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, first do this, then do this, then do this. But if you understand clearly how it functions together, all of those realizations are mentioned. And so it's a matter of putting it together, and this is what we study about, mainly based on the text of, we call the great charioteer Asanga, one of the 2 great charioteers, or great trailblazers of India, the Indian scholars. And then we also have we say the natural perfection of wisdom. So first was the path perfection of wisdom, and the natural perfection of wisdom refers to emptiness. So it's not something that we cultivate, it's just something that already exists naturally. The nature of all things is emptiness. So this relates to the wisdom side, that when we meditate on the path, we have to cultivate concentration, which is a meditative state. It's something we have to train our mind and body both in order to be able to do that. But what we focus on with concentration especially is emptiness. And so this is the wisdom side, and this was the explicit teaching in the Perfection of Wisdom. As you see in the Heart Sutra, it says very clearly, again and again, no form, no feeling. But it's understood, as it says at the beginning, perfectly looking at the 5 aggregates, it's empty of inherent nature. So no feeling doesn't mean that feeling doesn't exist. It means that feeling is empty of inherent nature. That same qualification is meant to be applied throughout the sutra, but it's only mentioned once. So Nagarjuna was the other great charioteer in India, and he explained very clearly the wisdom side. So all of these 6 texts, the Sixfold Collection of Reasoning, which I will explain very briefly, or explain very soon after we start, is explaining what the meaning of this this natural perfection of wisdom is within the sutras. Then we have the textual perfection of wisdom, which is the sutra itself. And then we have the resultant perfection of wisdom, which is the state of a Buddha, which is considered the actual perfection of wisdom. When we say perfection of wisdom, really what it means is the state of a Buddha. That's why it's perfect. It's the wisdom in Sanskrit, paramita, or parchin in Tibetan, which means gone to the other side. It's gone to the maximum. You can't go any farther. So it's wisdom that's reached the most cultivated state. So when we study these teachings of Nagarjuna, then the point is to, I'll open this, to get an understanding of what the Buddha meant when he was saying no form, no feeling, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body and mind, all those things. So here we have, can you all see? Shanti, you can see, right? So put it on the screen.
Yes,
okay, good. So here we have Nagarjuna's dispelling disputes. And then you see here, the picture here is actually of the 8,000 Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. This is the first page. And then we see below the young debater. So this is how we understand these teachings. It's not just enough to read it. We have to really think about it and question it. This is what we call the NÄLANDÀ tradition. So many of you probably know of Nālanda Monastery in India, in Northeast India, near Bodh Gaya. So I just want to compare briefly. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often talks about comparing the Nālanda tradition to other Buddhist traditions, especially what he calls the Pali tradition. He prefers that term to saying Hinayana because that's a bit of a derogatory term. So the people that are referred to by that probably wouldn't want to call themselves Hinayanist, and I understand. I don't really like using the term either, but they would refer to them as Pali tradition. This is what we agree on, that this is the teachings preserved in the Pali canon, the Pali language. So in this tradition, really the focus is to receive and transmit an authentic tradition without adding or subtracting. So it's understood that we receive these teachings from a teacher our teacher is understood to have realized them. Of course, we question them in the sense of we need to gain an understanding of them, but we have to be very careful not to adulterate the pure teachings. So we don't change them. We don't think, oh, maybe I could explain it this way differently. Maybe have a few of our own personal ways of saying things, but generally speaking, it's understood to be a complete corpus of teachings. There's no need to add or subtract to it, subtract from it. And the focus is on self-liberation. It's understood that through these teachings, one can achieve the state of an arhat. Now, in the Sanskrit tradition that also flourished in India, especially at Nālanda, but also at some other monasteries like Vikramashila or Dantapuri, is to use reasoning to examine and question the teachings, gain new insights, and generate one's own conclusions. Think outside the box. Consider how these traditional teachings can be applied to modern dilemmas and engage in dialogue with other disciplines like philosophy, psychology, and science. So, of course, in Nālanda, when we say science, I'm talking about modern science, and that didn't exist in ancient India as we know it today. But there were other disciplines in India that were becoming very prominent, especially the logic tradition, the Nyāyā tradition, especially of Indian logic, which didn't exist at the time of the Buddha. So some monks just ignored this and felt that this was not something that was worth pursuing, because as monastics, we already understand our teachings. We don't need to worry about what other developments and other traditions. But some people felt that it was actually useful to engage with what was happening in the culture and to engage in dialogue and debate with the followers of other traditions and make their own conclusions based on this. And as a result, the Buddhist tradition had to change a lot, because it's understood it's not just about pointing out the flaws of others. It's also about recognizing, well, maybe they have something to say that we could benefit from. This is what His Holiness the Dalai Lama always says about science, that if it happens that science proves beyond any doubt that something within our Buddhist tradition is wrong, then we have to abandon it. We can't just say, oh, it's the tradition and therefore I adhere to it, because actually that's contrary to the tradition. The tradition is very clear that one needs to base one's conclusions on reasoning and not just on what the teacher says. So this is related to the focus on great compassion, the benefit for all beings. Because if we only want to liberate ourselves, it's not really all that necessary to engage in dialogue with the whole world, because it doesn't matter so much. We don't have to worry about, can I explain this coherently to others? But if I really want to benefit others, I can't just talk in an ancient language or with an ancient system of philosophy. I have to really understand what people in the modern world, how they think, and be engaged in that, in a real way, not just engaged in the sense that I read their texts so I can tell them how wrong they are, but actually engage in dialogue where I have to develop myself. And the motivation for this has to be compassion. It's understood in the teachings that without great compassion, one won't be motivated to do that. It's not possible to sustain that motivation for so long without a real altruistic intention of feeling that I want to benefit not just myself, but many others. So then we have Nagarjuna, who, as we see here, lived sometime in the first half of the first millennium CE. So, as I've mentioned, in ancient India, philosophy was highly prized. It was an exceptional culture in terms of pursuing philosophy. But it does not seem that the keeping of historical records was prized to the same degree. So it's very, very difficult to place historical Indian figures. There are even people who claim that Nagarjuna never existed. Now, I think that's a bit, we'd say, tautology in logic, because if we define Nagarjuna as the author of root wisdom, then whoever wrote the book is Nagarjuna. So we can't really say he didn't exist unless it's by chance that many people got together and wrote the book. Different people wrote different chapters. But generally speaking, we define Nagarjuna as the author of root wisdom. But beyond that, we don't have any historical records of somebody named Nagarjuna who lived in a certain place at a certain time. In the Tibetan tradition, it's understood that he taught at NÄLANDÀ. This is definitely something that's disputed because we don't know when NÄLANDÀ was founded. NÄLANDÀ was actually destroyed in the 13th century. Many of you probably know this, by a band of Ghaziabads, a marauding group that entered India. Some people say, by Muslim invaders, but I think this is very unfair, because just because the people happen to identify themselves as Muslim does not mean that we can say that the Muslims destroyed NÄLANDÀ any more than we can say that the Christians destroyed the Incan Empire. It happened to be somebody who identified himself as Christian. But in any case, the monastery was burned to the ground, and memory of it faded from Indian tradition. And it was only in the 1840s that a British officer discovered some ruins, and gradually over about 20 years, they were able to determine that this really was the ancient university of NÄLANDÀ, which in the first millennium was probably the largest university in the world, and really a university in the sense of drawing scholars from all over, from places like Iran and Japan, Indonesia, so most of Asia, possibly even Greece. There were definitely Greek monks, Greek Buddhist monks. I don't know if there are any in NÄLANDÀ, but if there were, then there may have been Europeans there. So as far as we know, the first historical records of any edict from a king mentioning NÄLANDÀ are in the 4th century. So if Nagarjuna lived in the first century, as many scholars and historians say, it's not clear whether he could have taught at NÄLANDÀ, but it does seem likely that he taught at the place that later became the monastic university of NÄLANDÀ, in which case we could say that this was the roots of the NÄLANDÀ tradition, and then people continued to study there, and gradually it received royal funding and became a large university. So he's one of the 2 great charioteers, as I mentioned, along with Asanga, and the founder of the Middle Way, or the Madhyamaka school. which is understood as the middle way between the two extremes of eternalism and nihilism, which is a reference to the Buddha when he talked about his middle way between asceticism and hedonism. It's understood similarly that we don't want to go to either extreme. And then I've just mentioned here the book Nagarjuna in Context by Joseph Walzer, who was actually my professor in college. So he published this book about 15 years ago, and I was very happy to see it because I think he's a good scholar. And I think if anyone is interested in actual historical overview of Nagarjuna, or what we might know about him, I think this is a really good place to look. So Nagarjuna composed many different texts. Again, it's hard to know exactly which ones were really composed by. If we define Nagarjuna as the author of root wisdom, then we have to question, well, all the other texts, are they really by the same person? Now, in the Tibetan tradition, it's understood that at least among the ones that are translated into Tibetan, and we know that there are some at least that were not, we group them into three categories: the collection of reasoning, the collection of praises, and the collection of advice. So the collection of reasoning is the most important one because this is Nagarjuna's teachings on emptiness. Although even his teachings on, like his praises, which are praises of the Buddha, really talk a lot about emptiness. It basically says, this and such thing is empty for this reason. I praise the Buddha who taught that. But in terms of explicating emptiness very clearly with a lot of different levels of reasoning, it's in these 6 texts. So we start with root wisdom of the middle way, Mula Madhyamaka Karika, or in Tibetan, Umatsawa Shera. So this is the main text, is 27 chapters. It's not that long, actually. 27 chapters only fills about 60 pages in Tibetan, so each chapter is quite short. But it's the most extensive in terms of subject matter. It negates the subject matter of the true existence propounders. So people who say that things are truly existent, it specifically negates that. It says things do not truly exist for this and this reason. In 27 chapters, so it uses 27 main ways of approaching the problem, all based on teachings within the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And the next text is called Finely Woven. So actually, this is how I've always translated it, and this is how I've copied that from Jeffrey Hopkins, who I think is the best translator. So if I don't know the word myself, I usually rely on him. But now that I've been studying Nagarjuna's work more, and actually my hope is that if I teach another course, it will be on this finely woven. I think this word might actually mean ground to dust. It can be this same word in Tibetan. We have jimbo namtak. It can mean either of those. Tak can either mean to grind or to weave. And jitmo just can mean very subtle, or it can mean like dust, powder. So I think the idea is that it's grinding to dust the arguments of others. Because this, whereas root wisdom negates the subject matter, this negates the arguments. So the way the people who argue for true existence have a logical framework wherein they posit true existence. So rather than specifically negating true existence, it negates their entire logical framework and says that it's an unsound use of logic. It's a very short text. It's only about 6 pages, but it's incomprehensible. I've been reciting it for the past year and a half, and I don't know what it means. The understanding, what I see, is that if one reads this auto commentary, which I'm in the process of doing, Nagarjuna's own commentary on the text, then it actually becomes clear what it means. It's like a bunch of notes, an outline. So you just read an outline to something, you don't know what it's an outline of. So maybe if we have a chance later, we can go through this text together. So next we have 2 texts affirming conventionalities within the context of emptiness. So rather than negating that things exist inherently, it then comes back and says, although they don't exist inherently, still things can function on a conventional level. So first we have 70 stanzas in emptiness, which I was able to give a teaching on last December. So maybe some of you were here for that. If you're interested, I think you can get the recording if you haven't seen it. So this affirms conventionalities in a general sense. How can things function when things are empty? And it's a digression from chapter 7 of Root Wisdom, the chapter on birth, abiding, and disintegration. So at the end of this chapter, Nagarjuna says that compounded things do not exist Therefore, how could uncompounded things exist? Because compounded things do not exist because birth, abiding, and disintegration cannot be posited. So what does that mean? Does that mean nothing exists? So the text of 70 stanzas in Emptiness specifically starts by responding to that debate. It says that on a conventional level, things exist. This is how the Buddha taught, but when searched for under analysis, they can't be located. Next, we have Dispelling the Speech, the present text, which affirms how arguments can still negate wrong views. So rather than in general conventionalities can function, it shows that arguments can function. Logical reasoning can still function, even though things do not exist inherently. So of course, I'll be explaining a lot about what that means, and how these arguments can still negate wrong views. There can be a right view and a wrong view, and the argument can negate the wrong view. This is the digression from chapter 1 of Root Wisdom on conditions. And I will explain once we start the text exactly how that digresses from chapter 1. So finally, we have two texts showing how the mind realizing emptiness brings liberation. So rather than focusing on the object of the mind, it focuses on the realization. Why do we want to meditate on emptiness? So next we have 60 stanzas on reasoning, which I gave a teaching in January on this text, which shows how even Hinayana practitioners must realize emptiness to attain liberation. Now, I mentioned before, Hinayana, I don't like to use that term to refer to the tradition of the Pali tradition, but here it's referring to a particular practitioner. So again, it's a bit derogatory, but it's the best term I can come up with because this is what the tradition uses. So the understanding is that somebody who just wants to achieve self-liberation rather than achieving the full state of a Buddha still has to realize emptiness. This is actually very much a disputed point. A lot of Indian scholars did this. Even Bhavaviveka, who was one of the main commentators on Nāgārjuna, did not accept this. So it seems he probably understood this text in a different way. But certainly, according to Chandrakirti and our tradition, Tsongkhapa's tradition of Geluk, we understand this text to be saying that Hinayana practitioners must still realize emptiness. If one does not realize emptiness, it's not possible to attain any form of liberation. And then finally, Precious Garland, which is a very different text from the others because it's a book of advice to a king. So it contains a lot of general advice that's not related to emptiness, but especially the first chapter and to some extent the second and fifth chapters of the book do talk about emptiness. And it shows how Mahayana practitioners meditate on emptiness to achieve full Buddhahood. So it shows how the stages of realization and emptiness, how they function. So it's a little bit more on the method side of the path, but at least Tsongkhapa prefers to include it in the Sixfold Collection of Reasoning because it does have some very strong reasoning regarding emptiness. His Holiness the Dalai Lama actually quotes it quite frequently, has some very useful verses to meditate on. So Dispelling Disputes, the main commentaries we have, the auto commentary, which was undisputedly composed by Nagarjuna. So you might remember if anywhere you heard for the 70 stanzas course, there's the auto commentary to 70 stanzas, but it's actually highly disputed whether Nagarjuna actually wrote it. And there's also a text called Kali Jigme, which is supposed to be an auto commentary to Root Wisdom. And it's almost certain Nagarjuna did not compose it. Somebody else composed it and somehow it got the name Nagarjuna. But the auto commentary to this text, Dispelling Disputes, is undisputedly the same author of the text of Dispelling Disputes. Now, whether Nagarjuna wrote that text is a question, but actually it seems very likely that he did. Some modern scholars debate that, but I think it's more just a matter of liking to debate and liking to see, well, can we try to figure out, well, what could we say that he didn't write this text? The main argument seems to be that it's very different from Root Wisdom. It uses different arguments. If that's the only argument, it's quite a weak argument because any philosopher can use different arguments in different texts or different times in their life. Just because it uses different arguments does not mean it's necessarily a different author. And certainly Chandrakirti and Bhavaviveka, who are considered the most important commentators to Nagarjuna, clearly think that Nagarjuna wrote it. So unless they were completely mistaken and the whole tradition was wrong at the time, it's very, very likely that Nagarjuna wrote both the root text and the auto commentary. However, there were no other commentaries written in India or Tibet that we know of, which is unusual. Perhaps because the auto commentary is quite clear. Another reason might be that this text mainly negates the Nyāyā school of philosophy, the ancient Indian school of philosophy, whose texts were not translated into Tibetan. So in Tibetan, a lot of people had a hard time understanding what the book was arguing against. But very fortunately, just recently, this scholar from England, Jen Westerhoff, wrote this book, The Dispeller or Disputes, which translates the root text and the auto commentary, and also gives his very useful commentary, his own commentary, Westerhoff's commentary. It's clear that he understands the text very well. I like it a lot. It's better than a lot of the other books on Nagarjuna that I've read from other scholars. He understands the teachings better, and also understands Western philosophy well. So it's good because it also explains really clearly what he's arguing against, what the Nyāyā school actually posited themselves. So as I go through, occasionally I will use examples from him. He uses some very useful examples, and I'll mention when I do that. So here we have, debate is direct, but not hostile. So I mention this because this is a debate text. This text is specifically debating somebody. And if any of you sent out the translation, read the translation that I sent out, you'll see that it's quite direct. A lot of the verses are sort of written in a mocking tone by both sides, because some of the verses are written from the perspective of the opponent. But it's to be understood that this is the tradition. This is how knowledge was arrived at. We understand things through debating them. So here's a quotation from Chandrakirti, from his supplement to the Middle Way. You'll see as we go through, I've mentioned I like to translate, whenever there's verses, I try to translate it into English meter, because this is how it was written in ancient India. These books were not written in prose, these were written in poetry. And in Tibetan, it was translated into poetry. So I think in English, it's best, if possible, to follow that. But usually I don't use rhyme scheme, because that was not a tradition in Tibetan or in India, and also it's hard to do. But in this particular case, I actually found I was able to make it rhyme, so I thought it was nice. So this is Chandrakirti's explanation of Nagarjuna's use of faith. The text analyses he didn't make for penchant for debate, but freedom's sake. If when explaining thusness it ensues, that other systems fail, no fault accrues. Wrong notions are attachment to one's views, and animosity towards others' views. So lay aside your anger and your greed. Examine well, and quickly you'll be freed. So you see, he's saying, Nagarjuna made these arguments not because he liked debating, but because he wanted to achieve liberation, or help others to achieve liberation. So if in the process of explaining thusness or emptiness, it happens that others' systems of philosophy fall apart or fail, there's no fault in that, even though it might be seen as hostile by some people. The real wrong notions are being attached to one's view and animosity towards others' views. It's not a matter of, that stating one's view in a, in a helpful dialogue is a negative thing. It's when we get attached emotionally to our views. So this is what we have to lay aside, your anger and your greed, and examine well, and quickly you'll be freed. I mean, quickly you'll achieve liberation. So I've included here a couple of pictures of debate here at Sarah to give you an idea. You can see on the left, these are my classmates debating. And you see it's very animated, but they look like they're smiling. They're not angry at each other. It's a very good way to to analyze the text, not just to sit and read it alone in your room, or to write letters back and forth in a very dry way, but to really get actively involved. And you see on the right-hand side, this is my classmate debating me during our annual exams. You see he gets very animated when he debates. So next, we have empty of inherent existence. So this is something, so this first talk, I'll be mainly going through introductory points. It may actually even spill over into the second talk, because I think it's very good if we can get an idea of what are the themes that are going to be covered in this text, rather than simply reading the text, and we won't know the context, or especially if I give some examples in a moment, then I can always refer back to them and say, remember such and such example, then you can relate it to what's being said in the text. So when we say empty of inherent existence, the best way to understand this is when you search among the bases of designation, you cannot locate something that is the designated thing or that is the referent for the term. So a basis of designation means that when we talk about anything, there are certain other things on the basis of which we talk about that. So for example, if we talk about a house, we have a door and a wall and rooms and chairs and tables and people, fireplaces, whatever other things that we'd say constitute the basis of designation of a house. But when we search among them, we can't find anything that is the referent for the term. None of those individual things, nor the collection of them, actually constitute a house. So some of you might debate with that, but I'll try to explain with the examples why all of those would be logically problematic. So although we can use the term house, and a house can function, can provide shelter, it can protect us, it can be destroyed, still we can't actually locate what we're talking about when we say a house in a precise way. At the same time, all things that exist must fulfill three criteria. So they must be renowned to worldly convention, means that we must use terminology to refer to them. And I'll explain that point a little later, more specifically. So it doesn't just mean that anything exists. Although a house and the commonly given example of a non-existent thing is a horn of a rabbit are equal in not being able to be located under analysis, still one exists and one doesn't exist. So they must not be harmed by another conventional valid cognition. So a conventional valid cognition would be, for example, eyesight. I can see a house in front of me. I cannot see a horn of a rabbit. Now, not seeing a horn of a rabbit doesn't harm its existence because it could exist somewhere else, but I can use reasoning and collect a lot of data and pretty much make it pretty clear that this is a non-existent thing. That's all conventional valid cognitions. And again, also I will explain the difference between conventional valid cognition and ultimate valid cognition after the examples. I'll explain that. So it also must not be harmed by wisdom analyzing the ultimate. So the only thing that harms is true existence. Wisdom analyzing the ultimate shows that true existence does not exist. So although true existence might be renowned to worldly conventions, it only fulfills one or two of the criteria. It doesn't fulfill all three. So it's not an existent thing. So now I'll give some examples. So the first example I have here is fire and fuel. This is an example that Nagarjuna uses in his 10th chapter of the text. So he said, of root wisdom. So he says, if what is fuel was also fire, the subject object will be one. If fire is distinct from fuel, there'd still be fire with no fuel. So what he's saying that if fire and fuel, how do they relate to each other? Are they the same thing? But if they're the same thing, then the subject and object will be one, in the sense that I say fire burns fuel. For example, fire burns wood. So it's talking about two different things. Whenever we use any kind of grammatical statement of a subject and object, they have to be two different things. Now, of course, I could say, for example, I feed myself or something like that, but even then, it's understood that what really we mean by feeding myself is that putting food into my mouth with my hand, right? So there's actually two different things. There's the one feeding, the one being fed. Although they're understood to be the same person, temporally they're different. The one doing the feeding exists slightly before the one being fed. So there's the subject and object are two different things. Whereas if they were inherently one thing, then they couldn't act upon each other. But if fire is distinct from fuel, if it was a completely different thing from fuel, then there'd still be fuel with no fire, because it wouldn't depend on fuel. Even with no fuel, fire would just suddenly burst out. because it's a completely separate thing. So it obviously relates to fuel in a particular way, but it's not the same thing. So we have, Nagarjuna goes through the rest of this text, this chapter, explaining this. So he says, well, is it like a man meeting a woman? But again, a man meeting a woman, they exist separately and then they meet. Whereas it's not like fuel exists in one place and then later it meets fire and then meet up and then there's a fire burst out. That doesn't make any sense because the fire only exists once it meets the fuel. So a lot of people would argue, well, today we know better. We know that it's a combustion reaction. We know the molecular structure of what's happening, so we can explain it. So fire isn't really anything at all. It's just a matter of the combustion of these molecules. And then on the macroscopic level, we call it fire. But actually, Nagarjuna would probably argue that this gets away from what fire actually is. If you say that the combustion reaction is fire, he would ask, well, is the combustion reaction hot? And does it glow? So what does it mean to be hot? Right? It's the movement of molecules, this kinetic energy. Is that heat? But if no one's experiencing it, is it heat? Fire is what is hot and burning, we say, and that's generally the definition given for fire. So what does it mean to say that these molecules are hot? It really requires that somebody at the macroscopic level is experiencing this and then can see the flames and experience the heat to be able to say, oh, there's fire. So this is why I've written here, what you see is what you get. So I don't know if any of you know this term. Maybe I'm not very down with some of the lingo, but I know that when I was in 7th grade in school in America, I took one course on graphic design, the only time in my life I ever did anything like that. And our teacher, Mr. Sylvia, he gave us this phrase. He said, what you see is what you get, WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. So he said that you need to know whenever you use a software program, whether or not it's WYSIWYG. So for example, I'm using PowerPoint now, and this is WYSIWYG because whatever I design on the screen will show up when I display it. But if something is not WYSIWYG, then I can make all kinds of changes. For example, computer programming, I can program all this input into it, but no one actually sees that when they see the final product. So fire is just what you see is what you get. The combustion is something different. It's related to fire, but it's not itself fire. There's all kinds of logical consequences that would follow if we say that the combustion itself is fire. If we say that's what fire really is, then we'd say, well, the combustion reaction doesn't really exist either because it's made of molecules, which don't really exist because they're made of atoms. But atoms don't really exist because they're made of quarks, or they're made of neutrons and protons, which are made of quarks and so forth. So we'd say that nothing really exists. But conventionally, we can talk about them existing. We can talk about the interaction of the molecules, or we can talk about the interaction of the atoms, or we can talk about the interaction of fire and fuel. But at any point within this process, can we really locate the thing we're talking about? Does fire burn fuel, or does fuel create fire? Which one comes first? And how do they relate to each other? Conventionally, we can say perfectly fine, fire burns fuel, but if we want to analyze it, then we don't find anything that exactly corresponds to our conception of it. So on the right here, I have a couple of quotations. Now, a couple of times you'll find I've quoted Wittgenstein, the German philosopher. So I think of all Western philosophers, it seems to me that his philosophy is closest, especially to Chandrakirti, the interpreter of Nagarjuna. So it's useful. I don't necessarily consider him a yogi or an enlightened being. From what I read about him, I don't get that impression. But I think it's very useful because he explains things in a way that we might be more accessible to us, coming from a similar background. And oftentimes his reasoning is very similar to Chandrakirti's. So he says, when philosophers use a word, knowledge, being, object, I, proposition, name, and try to grasp the essence of the thing, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used this way in the language game, which is its original home? So this comes back to what is the essence of fire? If it's really this combustion reaction, When we use in common language fire, are we talking about molecules? And again, do we say molecules are hot or that molecules are glowing? So Wittgenstein, also very similar to Chandrakirti, he believes that language doesn't actually refer to something findable. And that if we try to grasp the essence behind it, it's missing the point. It's like we make up a phrase and then try to figure out what it is. And we're the ones who came up with the idea in the first place. We can't assume it has an existence outside that we can then locate. So Chandrakirti says very similarly, what need is there to engage in such in-depth analysis of worldly conventions? Their nature is only posited by obscured and faulty consciousness. So again, if we try to grasp the essence of it, we miss the point. Because if I dream about something, and then I dream about a particular person, then I try to research that person and find out all about him. Well, he's just in my dream. How am I going to find anything out? So this is something that we use in worldly convention. Within the context of worldly convention, we can analyze it, right? I can analyze, fire and fuel, and I can make very precise predictions. If in California, for example, we can estimate how many wildfires there are going to be this year and how we can stop them. And this is very important to do. But if then we try to see, well, what's the essence of wildfire? How does it really exist? Then we run into problems because we're leaving behind the conventional level. So next example we have is a broken table. So I don't know if any of you happen to see Lama Zopa Rinpoche, his online teachings he's been giving on a COVID crisis. We were very fortunate, a couple of us from Sarah, myself and Venerable Namdrung were at Kopan for 3 months last fall, so we were able to attend some of these teachings. And during this time, Rinpoche actually debated me a little bit about a table. And so I thought this was a very good example that came out in this conversation. So Rinpoche first asked me, do the parts of a table constitute a table? So we have the legs and the top, we have left back leg, box, apron, top, side, stretcher, left front leg, right front leg. So do these constitute a table? I said, no. This is Chandrakirti's reasoning, that if these constituted a table, then we could take it all apart. The parts are still there, but they don't constitute a table. So the parts don't constitute the table. Or you could say, well, in a particular shape, they constitute the table. But then the question that Chandrakirti asks is, well, does each individual shape constitute the table, or is it a different shape that's separate from the individual shapes constitute the table? And if you say individual one is, then again, you have the problem that the individual shapes are still there before you construct it. So then you say, okay, well, it's a different shape. It's one that you construct. So then this is a more difficult question, because it seems like people might say, well, it's when you construct it. But there are also problems with that. For example, if we break the table, if we break and we change the shape slightly, it still could be considered a table. So the shape might be different. It doesn't have to be exactly. We could bend the table and we can still consider a table. So also, Chandrakirti uses the understanding of when you say that something is inherently existent, then you have to say that it's posited on something. So if a table is posited on the shape of a table, but then the shape of the table also has to be posited on something else, right? So with a shape of table, it's already using the word table. So you say, what's a table? What's the shape of a table? Well, what's the shape of a table? How do we actually define it? And also, you say the shape of a table is a table. Then we say the shape of something is that thing. But we can't say that for a lot of things, that the shape of that thing is that thing. Is the shape of a person a person? This is problematic because the person constitutes both mental and physical elements, and physical elements have shape, but mental elements don't. So this, I won't get too much into this argument because it's actually a very detailed argument and very useful. Maybe in a different course we can do that. But then the point that Rinpoche then made was, then he asked me about a broken table, as opposed to saying the parts of a table. So he said, is a broken table a table? And I said, it depends how broken it is, right? So this first one we have in the top left, I'd say people would probably still say that's a table because it can still function as a table. It's in bad shape and you probably couldn't get a lot of money for it, but you wouldn't say, oh, there's no more tables. You say there's a broken table, we still use it. This one below it is a little bit more questionable, whereas the one on the right side is definitely, we'd say there's no longer a table. You broke it, it's gone. We just have the pieces, the remainder, the ruins of the table. It was once a table. But then Rinpoche asked, well, if a broken table is a table, why aren't the parts of a table the table? And this is where I said, after some thought, I think Chandrakirti would say that asking whether the parts of a table constitute a table is a form of ultimate analysis. This is not about worldly convention, because worldly convention does not say the parts of a table are a table. Nobody says that. It's not in our common parlance. We don't say, if someone says, what is a table? You don't say, oh, it's the shape of a table. You say it's something that can support objects. Or maybe more detailed, but you don't talk about how you find it among its bases of designation. That constitutes ultimate analysis. Whereas asking whether a broken table is a table is a conventional term. It's in our conventional framework. It's actually an important question, because if I sell you a table, I say, yeah, it's still a table. It's a little broken, but it's still a table. And then if I sell it to you without you seeing it, and I send it to you and you realize, oh, it's actually broken, you could sue me in court. And we could go through a very detailed analysis of bearing false witness or making false claims that I said this was a table, but it's not a table because it's actually broken. So this is something that within worldly convention, we can use analysis. It's not a question of how it ultimately exists. So the next example we have is Peugeot, the French car company. So this example I drew from this book that many of you may know, Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I hope sorry if I mispronounced the name. So he's an Israeli scholar. Somebody donated this book to our house a few years ago, and I just read it recently. I would say it's an excellent book. Although one thing I would mention that I found that I think that the author, although he's clearly very, very well read, it seems to me occasionally he intersperses his own opinion, which is perfectly fine, but doesn't really distinguish his own opinion from what's a factually established thing. And most importantly, I think, like most mainstream science authors, he seems to take it for granted that materialism, which is mainly the point of view that the mind is a product of the brain, he takes it for granted that this is established scientifically, and that any other view is really obsolete. And actually, it's interestingly, at one point in the book, he says, currently scientists have absolutely no idea how the mind emerges from the brain. So he admits that we don't actually know how this happens, but he takes it for granted that it does happen, even in the context of mentioning how important it is to acknowledge our own ignorance. And if we don't do that, then we can't really make any progress in terms of understanding. So I say that just because I think it's useful in terms of what we'll be talking about later. One of the other introductory topics I'll be giving is about the philosophy of mind. And I will specifically talk about materialism and how this is something that's really taken for granted in a lot of scientific circles, even though I think there's a lot of logical problems with it. And this is something that in the context of this very text, Dispelling Disputes, this will come up. But that's not what I'm going to talk about here. So in this context, Harari, he uses one very good example in the book about the Peugeot Corporation and analyzes, how does this exist? So I'll read actually the selection from the book, and I think about what he's saying and think about, does this sound like Madhyamaka philosophy? So he says, this is on page 31 of the book, if any of you happen to have it. People easily understand that quote unquote primitives cement their social order by believing in ghosts and spirits and gathering each full moon to dance together around the campfire. What we fail to appreciate is that our modern institutions function on exactly the same basis. Take, for example, the world of business corporations. Modern business people are lawyers, and lawyers are in fact powerful sorcerers. The principal difference between them and the tribal shamans is that modern lawyers tell far stranger tales. The legend of Peugeot affords us a good example. An icon that somewhat resembles the Stadel lion man, which is if some of you might know, it's an ancient painting, cave painting in France, appears today on cars, trucks, and motorcycles from Paris to Sydney. It's the hood ornament that adorns vehicles made by Peugeot, one of the oldest and largest of Europe's cars makers. Peugeot began as a small family business in the village. Actually, I'll skip this part. So we just say, so in what sense can we say that Peugeot, Peugeot SA, the company's official name, exists? There are many Peugeot vehicles, but these are obviously not the company. Even if every Peugeot in the world were simultaneously junked and sold for scrap metal, Peugeot SA would not disappear. It would continue to manufacture new cars and issue its annual report. The company owns factories, machinery, and showrooms, and employs mechanics, accountants, and secretaries. But all these together do not comprise Peugeot. A disaster might kill every one of Peugeot's employees and go on to destroy all of its assembly lines and executive offices. Even then, the company could borrow money, hire new employees, build new factories, and buy new machinery. Peugeot has managers and shareholders, but neither do they constitute the company. All managers could be dismissed and its shares sold, but the company itself would remain intact. It doesn't mean that Peugeot SA is invulnerable or immortal. If a judge were to mandate the dissolution of the company, its factories would remain standing and its workers, accountants, managers, and shareholders would continue to live. But Peugeot SA would immediately vanish. In short, Peugeot SA seems to have no essential connection to the physical world. Does it really exist? Peugeot is a figment of our collective imagination. Lawyers call this a legal fiction. It can't be pointed at. It is not a physical object, but it exists as a legal entity. Just like you or me, it is bound by the laws of the country in which it operates. It can open a bank account and it can own property. It pays taxes and it can be sued and even prosecuted separately from any of the people who own or work for it. So then just a couple of pages later, he says, telling effective stories is not easy. The difficulty lies not in telling the story, but in convincing everyone else to believe it. Much of history revolves around this question. How does one convince millions of people to believe in particular stories about gods or nations or limited liability companies? Yet when it succeeds, it gives sapiens, which means Homo sapiens, humans, immense power because it enables millions of strangers to cooperate and work toward common goals. Just imagine how difficult it would have been to create states or churches or legal systems if we could only speak about things that really exist, such as rivers, trees, and lions. So I wonder if anybody can say, and if you can type into the chat if you like, does anybody think there's a problem with this reasoning according to Madhyamaka philosophy?
Is that in terms of being able to find to identify Peugeot?
So you're asking, it's saying that it cannot identify Peugeot. Is that the problem?
Is that your question?
I'm saying his reasoning is that he goes through all of these possible things, like the employees, all the buildings, all the assets, they're not Peugeot. Yeah. So he says Peugeot is a legal fantasy. So is there anything different from that from Madhyamaka philosophy?
Yeah, it's not a legal fantasy. It's a real. It's conventionally existent,
Yes,
but
that's
it is
exactly.
imputed.
Yes. So let's see in the chat. Yeah. Saying that rivers truly exist might be problematic. The analyzing on the conventions, but without analyzing the ultimate. Okay. So first of all, Shanti gave exactly the answer I was looking for. Exactly that he concludes that because we cannot locate it among the basis of designation, it therefore is non-existent, whereas things like lions and rivers and trees exist. According to Madhyamaka philosophy, this is what's called not identifying the object of negation. You don't distinguish the thing that exists from the object of negation, which is the findable thing among the basis of designation. So Peugeot, it's true, we can't find it. It doesn't exist in any of these ways. It's not the people, it's not the buildings. So again, saying rivers truly exist might be problematic. Now this, again, if we talk about truly exist, yes, rivers do not truly exist, nor do lions, nor humans. But according to Madhyamaka philosophy, things either exist or don't exist. There's no different ontological status. So in the sense of, we can't say that some things don't exist, some things partially exist, and some things truly exist. Everything that exists in mere name, or some things don't exist at all because they don't exist in mere name. But nothing truly exists because everything is the same as Peugeot. It's true, all of his reasoning about Peugeot we'd agree with, but that same reasoning applies to every single other thing that exists. So Peugeot, is he analyzing conventions, but without analyzing the ultimate? Actually, I'd say he's analyzing the ultimate, but then he takes it to refute conventions. So that's the problem. If you mix up conventional analysis with ultimate analysis with conventional analysis, you can come to the conclusion that nothing exists. And this is why Madhyamakas are often accused of being nihilist, because their opponents do not understand that they are analyzing from the ultimate level. They're not talking about conventionalities. So Peugeot and the table from the previous slide are the same. So yes, so this is what I have here, the table at the bottom. Harari says that non-existence include things like gods and Peugeot. Existence include things like lions and humans. Now Nāgārjuna would change that a little bit. Non-existence, now I put gods, I put a little star next to it because I think in the Buddhist tradition, they would actually understand the gods to exist in a particular way. But when Madhyamaka reasoning often takes the point of view of the opponent. So, okay, you say gods don't exist because you say they're completely non-existent. Okay, that's fine, they don't exist. Similar to a rabbit's horns. So you see here the little picture, this is a jackalope, but it's actually a made-up creature. There's no such thing. Just putting deer's horns or antelope's horns on a rabbit. So rabbit's horns don't exist, but Peugeot exists and humans exist. So why? So next I have corporations versus humans. So we have the Peugeot Corporation, and then we have Armand Peugeot, who was the founder of the Peugeot Corporation. Now we'd ask, is it true that Armand Peugeot exists, but the Peugeot Corporation doesn't exist? Well, when we say the Peugeot Corporation, as Harari himself says, it can be sued, and it can make decisions, and it can speak. If the chief executive officer of Peugeot makes a statement, we say, Peugeot responded this way, they said this. So we'd say, if Armand Peugeot makes a statement when he was alive, his mouth is making the statement, right? It's coming from the mouth or the lips or the tongue, whatever. So how is that different? We'd say that when the CEO makes a statement, Peugeot makes a statement. When Armand Peugeot's mouth makes a statement, he makes a statement. Likewise, we can say that Peugeot can be sued, and Armand Peugeot can be sued. But when we say we sue him, does that mean, can you point to where the lawsuit is occurring on his body? And moreover, when we say he himself, as originally he was the executive, I don't think they had the word CEO in those days, but he was the executive officer of Peugeot. Does that exist anywhere on him? Because he's just as much as he's Armand Peugeot, he's also an executive officer. That's also a name for a person. but we can't locate that anywhere on his body. I don't know if we look through his mind, if we can locate something that we say that's the executive officer right there. And likewise with Armin Peugeot, the name. It's a name that his mother or his father, or both of them, gave him. We can't locate that name anywhere on him, anywhere within the body or within the parts of the body or the collection. But we might say, well, yeah, but still, we can see him. He moves around and does things. Well, we can see the Peugeot Corporation right here. If we point to this, we would say that's Peugeot over there. We could also say it's Peugeot headquarters, but it would be perfectly fine to say that's Peugeot. And people would understand what you're talking about. We say, well, it doesn't move. Well, it could move. They could move it from one town or district to another. So it moves. It doesn't move in quite the same way as Armin Peugeot moves, but it's a matter of different kinds of movement. It still moves. But we often have the conception that there's something actually that we can say is different, that Peugeot, there's a person there. There's somebody behind this that's doing these things. Whereas the corporation is just a mental construct. And this is how Harari, the author, he identifies them as different. But Nagarjuna would say they're exactly the same. Ontologically, they both exist. Ultimately, we can't look at either of them. So next we have example 4, pain. So in this example, I'm trying to isolate what do we mean when we say pain. You can say I'm in pain and people will understand you. And either of these pictures, you could probably say, oh yeah, that's pain. But of course, that's not really pain, because pain is a sensation. You don't look at the picture and feel pain. But then we say, well, what is a sensation? What is a sensation of pain? Now, some of you might remember in the 70 stanzas talk, I had some examples also when I had the color red. And I said, well, I had the picture of the sun, and then the light rays coming from the sun, and the wavelengths of the light, and a red bird, the light reflects off the bird, and then the eye, the light reflected off the bird hitting the eye, and then the process in the brain, the visual cortex, and then I had a box with just filled in red, so we said the qualia, the experience of red. Which one of those, if any of those, is red? So it's very similar here in a certain sense. You know, is it banging your hand is pain? Is it the nerve endings in your hand that register that? The question of what you mean by register is also a little bit sticky, but I won't go into that. So then the impulses that go to the brain, that go up the spinal cord, the brain stem, is it the registering of that in the brain? Is it something else? Is it the experience? Is it this facial expression this man is making? Is that pain? So all of these have certain logical problems. It's very similar to red. But what's different from red is that when we understand pain, we don't understand pain to be something different from the experience of pain. We say, I experience red, but we understand that I, here as a subject, am experiencing something outside of myself that's red. Whereas when we say I experience pain, is the experience of pain any different from pain itself? This becomes a very important question within this text as we come into the question of self-cognizers. So this will come up later. But for now, I want you to have the example and to think, what is pain? Is it any of those steps within the process? And even if we identify pain as the experience of pain, well, then how is it that I can say I experience pain if it's experience and pain are the same thing? How can subject and object be the same? Like when I say, does fire burn fuel? If fire and fuel are the same thing, then how can fire burn fuel? Now I say I feed myself, but the one feeding and the one being fed exist slightly temporally different times. Whereas when I experience pain, it's not like first there's pain, then I experience it. It's that very experience itself that is pain. So next we have the example baking a cake. So this comes into the question of what we call birth from other. So some of you had questions when I talked about this again with the 70 stanzas. We have the question of are things born from their self, born from another. So when we say born from another, we would say, well, I make a cake. I'm different from the cake. So we have this little girl on the left side here making a cake. Now, somebody with a very strange imagination, if I say, well, she's making a cake, they could look at this picture and say, well, where's the cake? You said she's making a cake. I don't see any cake. Well, we'd say, well, look, here's the result. That's the cake she made. But you'd say, no, she's beating the dough. She's not making a cake. There's no cake there. There's nobody doing anything to anything. So this might just sound like a silly word game, but this is really what's being talked about when we talk about there's no birth from other. We can't really point to this thing doing that thing. If they were really existed, we should be able to say, here's one thing acting upon another thing. To say she made a cake is really just a conceptual construct. We connect the dots. We have this person here doing this thing, then we have this result, and we say she made the cake. Because we could just as well say her brain made the cake, because there are impulses in her brain that are sending signals to the hands that are doing this work. Or we could say her hand made the cake, or her muscles made the cake. Or we could say her mother made the cake. I don't know if this is a grandmother, but in any case, we could say her grandmother made the cake because she gave birth to the daughter who gave birth to her, who gave birth to the cake. Or we could say she's making digestive fluid because she's making the cake that somebody eats and digests. Or we could say she's making excrement because that's where the cake ends up. Although we say ends, there's a whole long process. We could say she's feeding the birds because she makes the excrement that goes into the ground, that grows the trees, that bring the seeds that the birds eat. So it's we're making this connection and saying she's making a cake. It's our conceptual understanding of what's happening. We can't actually locate that anywhere in this physical reality here. We can't say, here's the cake that she's making. So we have, again, Wittgenstein. A misleading analogy lies at the root of this idea. The causal nexus seems to be established by a mechanism connecting two parts of a machine. So we think of it that when we talk about the causal nexus of the world, how things function, that we can isolate, here's this thing acting on this thing. This is how classical physics was understood. There are these inherently existent billiard balls, we'd say, these atoms that act on each other. But conceptually, that doesn't work. And it wasn't actually conceptually abandoned before it was found to be evidence contrary to this. The things like black body radiation and the activity of light in a vacuum showed that classical physics no longer worked in certain circumstances. But actually, conceptually, it also doesn't work. There are conceptual problems with the idea of all of these separate things acting on each other in a static background of space. That's not how the world functions. It's not like there's two different things. We can isolate, here's the person making the cake, and here's the cake, these two different cogs within a machine. If we think about the universe as a giant machine, it can be very helpful for making predictions like sending men to the moon. But it actually doesn't explain exactly how things exist. It's only a conceptual construct. So next, the last example, this is quite difficult, but this, I think, if you can understand this, it might give some idea of Chandrakirti's reasoning. So this is an example specifically that Chandrakirti uses to negate other philosophers. He's actually arguing against other Buddhists in this case. And this is about how we talk about bases and attributes. So bases and attributes is a very simple thing. Almost any time we talk, even though we don't understand logic, we are still using bases and attributes. And this is how grammar functions. It's quite remarkable that children can learn grammar without actually consciously understanding what bases and attributes are. But every grammatical sentence says something. For example, the table is red. So the table is the basis and the attribute is red. And this is how we talk. And we attribute attributes to bases all the time. But the problem is that, as Chandrakirti says, that when it appears to us as if the attributes exist inherently on the basis, there's some inherently existent basis that then possesses these attributes, as if they were separate, as if they existed in a real way separately. So he gives some very unusual examples. The two he gives, I have the top here, the mortar's body and Rahula's head. So the first one, they basically are the same problem in both cases. There's something where the attribute is coextensive with the basis. So a mortar here, we see this is a pestle and a mortar. So forget the pestle, just think of the mortar, the bottom part here. The mortar doesn't exist different from the body. We say the mortar's body. I mean, I don't know if anyone would say that. It's a bit funny to say that. But where is the body? It's just a round thing. It's not like a person where you can say, well, here's the head, there's the body in the sense of the torso, there's the legs. There's just a body. So the mortar's body, is it really referring to something different than the mortar or something different than the body? Yet at the same time, we can say the mortar's body. Mortar has a body, we say. It possesses a body. Even though the body, if you take away the body, where's the mortar? And likewise, Rahula's head. So this is based on an Indian legend of Rahula, who was supposed to, I don't know the whole story, but basically he was some kind of spirit figure who had his head off. And so because he's a spirit, he doesn't die, so his head just flies around. This is understood to be how eclipses function, that Rahula eats the sun or the moon. But because he has no body, while he's eating it, you can't see it, but then it just comes out and you can see it again. So this flying around this head, this disembodied head. So you can say Rahula's head, he has a head, but who is he beside the head? If you take away the head, where's Rahula? So there's no bases separate from the attribute, but at the same time, conceptually, or just conventionally, we talk about Rahula's head. So I tried to think of some other examples. So the sun's orb, we don't say that, but a lot of people say the orb of the sun. So it's the same idea. It's just the genitive case, the sun's orb. So what is the sun different than the orb? But still we say, here's the orb of the sun. Or the skull's bones. Now this is a little different because it has individual bones, but generally speaking, other than the bones, there's no skull, right? But we can say the bones of the skull. So somebody actually debates back with Chandrakirti and says, well, it's like talking about the solidity of solids, right? It's really just a definition of something. What makes something a solid is that it has solidity. So it's not really any problem here. It's different than talking about, for example, the person's body, because a person is more than just a body, according to Buddhist philosophy. A person has a mind, which is different than a body. But solidity of solids is just saying that what is a solid? It's something that has solidity. But Chandrakirti said this is actually different than the other examples. The reason being that when we use language, if somebody says solidity, nobody asks, well, whose solidity are you talking about? And say, oh, I'm talking about the solidity of solids, because that doesn't make any sense. You don't wonder, is he talking about the solidity of solids or the solidity of liquids or the solidity of gases? Only solids have solidity, so you can only be referring to that. Whereas if you say head, somebody says, well, whose head? So Rahula's head. Oh, okay. But we then eliminated other heads. But at the same time, Rahula's head, who was Rahula except for the head? Or you say body, you say whose or the body of what? And in Tibetan, we have the word, it could mean body like a person's body, but also in English, like we also have just like the structure or something, the frame. So whose body? Well, the mortar's body. Oh, okay, now I understand what you're talking about. It wasn't clear before, right? So conceptually, we think about them as different things, whereas solidity and solids, we understand to be the same thing, just in terms of the definition and what it defines. So the last example I have here, one of my classmates, very, very sharp debater, he came up with this example. What about the head's ears? So if somebody says the ears, you say, well, whose ears? Well, the head's ears. Were you wondering, was it the body's ears or the foot's ears or the hand's ears? That's not a question that comes up. So this is a bit different. This is a attribute, but it only belongs to heads. It doesn't have to, it could belong to many different heads, but if you have ears, it has to belong to somebody's head, unless somebody cuts off an ear, but that's a different question. It still originates on a head. So I don't know actually what you would say about that. I'm not sure what Chandrakirti would say to that. But again, it just shows the way that we use language as if things are self-evident. We could talk about the head's ears, but what do you think about, what are you saying? And what are you saying when you say the skull's bones with Rahula's head? It's as if these things exist separately. And that's how they appear to our mind. But actually, when we conceptually try to analyze them and point to the different things, the possessor and the possessed, what are they? So next we have worldly renown. So these were the 6 examples. Again, I might refer back to them during the talks. So I said that there's 3 criteria for something to exist conventionally. And the first is that it's renowned in the world. Now, what does that mean? And actually, this was again a question that Lama Zopa Rinpoche asked about. And I didn't have a great answer at the time. But I talked to one of my teachers here at Sarah when I got back and got a little more insight into what they're talking about. So worldly renown does not mean it need not be written well known in the world. It's not like it has to be famous. So we say worldly renown, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche asked the question, well, what about something that only I know about, my own private knowledge? It exists conventionally, but is not renowned. But that's not what we're being talking about when we say worldly renown. It's not everything that somebody imagines exists. So it's not there's something that is renowned in the sense of, it's well renowned that such and such thing exists when actually everyone's wrong. Among things posited by mind, there was a distinction between those that exist and those that did not exist. However, this is the most important one, the third one. However, its mode of establishment is similar to the mode of establishment of worldly things. So this is what's meant by worldly renown. Its way of being known is similar to worldly convention. So it's not something that is discovered through ultimate analysis. It's simply something that we posit it based on bases of designation. We then have those appear to our minds and say such and such thing. In other words, it is conventionally efficacious, yet upon examination cannot be located among its bases of designation. So everything exists that way. Everything that exists through worldly renown, even emptiness itself. Because emptiness itself, even when you try to find emptiness, you can't find it. It exists upon basis of designation. So when you talk about a thing like a pot, which is the example we usually use, a vase, a pot, then when you search for it, you find the pot's emptiness. But then when you take that emptiness itself and search for that, you also can't find it because it has basis of designation, one of which is the pot upon which it's designated. Without the pot, this is why we talk about form as emptiness, emptiness as form in the Heart Sutra. You can't really point to emptiness except for the emptiness of a particular thing. You can't just find this great emptiness that exists in and of itself without relying on something else. So everything that exists in this approximate way. We can talk about it, we can make coherent statements about it, but when we actually try to analyze it, we can't find it. So then we have conventional and ultimate analysis. I mentioned before the distinction, and here's how we define the differences. Conventional analysis takes the ordinary convention as a starting point. So it talks within the ordinary framework of how we talk about things, and then ask questions within that framework. So you say, he arrived. You say, well, what time did he arrive? And where did he arrive from? Where is he going next? Who is he? Is he the person you were talking about before? Is he somebody different? All these questions we can ask can be extremely precise and detailed and can make accurate and distinctions between objective right and wrong. If we have, for example, forensic science, it's very, very detailed. A lot of people would say this is an exact science. It can identify fingerprints, and one person's fingerprints are not the same as someone else's. So it's not like it's just approximate in the sense of being very rough or just kind of how we talk about it in the world. Somebody could be an expert on something and still be using conventional analysis. Whereas ultimate analysis is something totally different. It's not satisfied with the mere convention. It searches among the bases of designation to locate if any single one of them or combination of them constitutes the convention, and is never able to locate anything except the emptiness of the object sought. So here we have a non-meditating. So this is a kind of analysis that we do conceptually. It's not something that we do by physically examining things with a microscope or a magnifying glass or whatever else. So this is not what a criminal forensic scientist is not going to use ultimate analysis. He might ask, who was that person that arrived and what time did he arrive precisely, or what second? And can we find an alibi? Was he somewhere else? Can we analyze this DNA evidence that we have? But he's not going to ask that person that arrived, was he his body? Was he his arms? Was he his legs? Or was he a collection of them? This is irrelevant to the question of who committed the crime. But it's very relevant to asking, our experience of the world, does it relate to something that exists in and of itself? Or is it just merely a conceptual construct that we're living in? And so, again, this question earlier of Peugeot versus a human, the question then becomes, sometimes we might mix these two up, and a lot of philosophies do this. And therefore, they either go to the extreme of saying, well, things have to exist somehow, otherwise nothing exists. And we know things exist, and we see that certain effects have certain causes. So we have to be able to posit something that exists. So then they say, well, among the basis designation, such thing really is a thing. You have to posit it. Or they go to the other extreme and say, nothing exists. Everything's just conventional, and there's no real truth. And so one example of this is postmodern philosophy, which in some of its more extreme manifestations denies that science has any access to truth. Now, I think in certain contexts, postmodern philosophy makes some very insightful points. But if we try to say, therefore, because we can't really locate something, therefore physics doesn't really tell us anything at all. Well, physics can obviously tell us a lot of things because it's made some very good discoveries that are very useful within a certain framework. So we don't go outside of the bounds. If we want to step outside that framework and recognize that that framework is merely conventional, that's one kind of analysis. But if we want to therefore say any statement made within that framework is wrong, we can't distinguish between right and wrong statements. This is mixing the two kinds of analysis. So this is something, again, that is very central to this text, Dispelling Disputes, about what is the dispute about. It's about the difference between these two kinds of analyses. So a very good analogy of this was given by the Buddhist scholar Buddhapalita, the temple analogy. So he says, imagine two men in a temple looking at an image of, we have here the god Shiva. And they're arguing. One is saying that's Shiva, and one is saying, no, it's Vishnu. And they're getting very heated in the argument. So then somebody comes along and says, what are you talking about? That's not Shiva or Vishnu, it's just a painting. So that person who says that, at some level, they're right. But it's irrelevant to the argument, because the people in the argument are not arguing about whether this is really Shiva. They're arguing about, is this the painting of Shiva? But they don't use the word painting. They just say, is it Shiva? Is it Vishnu? Now, if it got to the point where they forgot they were talking about a painting, then it would be useful for somebody to come along and say it's just a painting. And this is what happens. We make a conventional framework, and we live our life within that framework, and we forget that it's just a framework. And then we start making statements as if they have some kind of reality beyond the framework. And that's why Buddhapalita comes along and points out to us, actually, you're just within a particular framework. This is just a painting. It's just your own creation. So next I have a few introductory topics, or two introductory topics, philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, which are the two main themes within the text. So I think it's 12:40 Indian time now, so I'll do about 10 more minutes that we can do the closing prayers. Or actually, what I'll say now is if people have questions, we can also leave these topics for tomorrow. So if people have questions, we can have question and answer now, and if not, we can go on with the topics.
You can put your hand up in the participant list. I think yeah, there's a way to do that. Or you can unmute.
Or you can write the question, or whatever you prefer.
Ankita, if you have a question, you can unmute.
So thank you, Shantila. Thank you, Venerable, for your precious teaching. My question is regarding the Arya Chandrakirti. If you like to answer, it's a very elementary question.
Okay, yes.
This I want to know that how Arya Chandrakirti is related with Arya Nagarjuna. Was he the translator or was he the commentator of his
Yeah,
work?
that's a very good question. Yeah, and I apologize if I didn't clarify because I think I think some things for granted. It's hard to know exactly how much everyone knows about the background. So I think it's good I can mention. So we all know, just going even more back, the Buddha lived probably about 500, 600 BCE. It's not actually entirely sure, but probably around then. Whereas Nagarjuna probably lived around in the 1st century CE, so about 600 years after the Buddha. And Nagarjuna was the founder of the Madhyamaka school. So all the other subsequent teachers within this school were commentators on him. So Nagarjuna's main disciple was Aryadeva, who lived at the same time as him, and he wrote mainly the text, the 400 stanzas on emptiness. So these are considered we call the fundamental Madhyamakas, because all other Madhyamaka scholars consider these as authoritative. Then after that, there were many disputes between different Madhyamakas, so it's split into different factions. A faction isn't quite the right word, because especially in India, there was no real distinction. There's this school, this school. There was the Madhyamaka school, but there wasn't within that particular divisions, but there were certainly disagreements. And then the Tibetan tradition has therefore divided the scholars into different categories for ease of understanding, but it's good to remember that that actually wasn't a division that was made in India. So some of the next scholars, I mentioned this Kala Jigme before. I don't know how you say that in Sanskrit. Jigme is fearless. Kale, so completely fearless is actually the name of the text. But that some people thought that was an auto commentary. But it's probably not an auto commentary, but it shows that it was probably the first major commentary on Nagarjuna's work that was composed, sometime after the 1st century. We don't know when. And then there was another commentator called Deva Sharma, who was a little later. And then so Bhavaviveka was the first one that was a major commentator in the sense that in Tibet, it was very well read, very highly respected. And Bhavaviveka actually followed Deva Sharma to a great extent. But Deva Sharma is not, I don't even know if it's translated in Tibetan. So Bhavaviveka was probably about the 5th century, I think 6th century BC, I say CE. So Bhavaviveka was at NāLANDÀ for sure. He was a Brahmin. I think he was actually a prince, a Brahmin, and I don't know if he could be both a Brahmin and a prince. So I don't know if that's true, but he was definitely a Brahmin. He was, he's very highly respected. But the reason I mention that is because that's understood in his philosophy that you can see it's a bit like the high colloquial. He's a bit, still has the kind of Brahmin mentality of viewing society in a particular way, which is part of how Chandrakirti then later criticizes him. But I should mention also before Bhavaviveka was Buddhapalita. So these were the first two. I said Bhavaviveka was the first major one, but I forgot Buddhapalita first at NāLANDÀ. And then Bhavaviveka came along and criticized Buddhapalita. So Buddhapalita wrote a text, a commentary on root wisdom that then Bhavaviveka criticized. And actually, I will mention tomorrow what the nature of that criticism was, because it's relevant here. And then later, after Bhavaviveka had died, because he was a Brahmin, it seems, he was so highly respected that no one criticized him during his life because it was considered a little bit politically incorrect to do so. But then after he passed away, Chandrakirti was actually the abbot of NāLANDÀ for a time, and he heavily criticized Bhavaviveka. Heavily criticized doesn't mean he a lot of things he agreed with, but certain points he heavily criticized and defended Buddhapalita. So we consider that Buddhapalita was the first of what we call the prasangika, the consequentialists, but he didn't explicitly explain why the Prasangika view is the better view. Whereas in the process of defending Buddhapalita, Chandrakirti really made it clear what this Prasangika distinction was. So it's really Chandrakirti's text that we use in Tibet to understand Nagarjuna. He was a commentator, but at least according to Tsongkhapa's understanding, he really understood what Nagarjuna was talking about. Whereas, and Buddhapalita also did, but didn't explain it quite as clearly as Chandrakirti did. Whereas in Bhavaviveka's case, he made some fundamental errors. Although he's very highly respected and was a great scholar, he still was adhering to true existence, even though he didn't use that term. And I'll explain tomorrow what that means. Now, you asked, were they disciples? So actually, in the Tibetan tradition, it's understood that Nagarjuna lived to be 600 years old, and Bhavaviveka and Chandrakirti are both understood to have been his disciples. Now, historically, whether we can verify that or not, I really have no idea. It seems to the kind of thing that unless we find some very clear evidence that that happened, it could be hard to accept, but it's really kind of relevant in the sense of, Chandrakirti was Nagarjuna's student in the sense of having read his texts and mainly commentating on them. So most Indian scholars are classified as either followers of Bhavaviveka's system or followers of Chandrakirti's system.
So to Krishna Venerable.
Yes. Okay.
Go ahead, Tejala.
Thank you. Thank you, Venerable, so much for your teaching. Venerable, I'm wondering if you could speak a few more words about how we establish worldly convention. With that, we say that it should not be contradicted by a valid mind analyzing convention. So I am still not very clear, is my internet connection okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's okay. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So if you could speak a little bit more, because when we define conventional truth, one of the definition is that it's an object found by a valid cognition, which analyzes conventions, and with respect to which the valid cognition analyzing the convention becomes a valid cognition analyzing convention. So it seems like the definition itself has this mutual dependency of the object and subject. That the subject is valid because the object is valid, the object is valid because the subject is valid. So somewhere I feel like I still don't have clarity. How do we say that this mind is a valid mind in relation to this conventional truth? So please, if you could speak a little bit more about that. Thank you.
That's an excellent question and actually very relevant. For one thing, that will come up in the context of the debate in terms of the Nyāyā school of philosophy and their understanding, very similar to what you're saying. This is what Nagarjuna criticizes them, is that they say that things are established by valid cognition, and then come back and say valid cognition is what the thing that establishes real things. So how it becomes a tautology. But in Tibet, and in India, this was also a major question. So again, to just mention briefly about the history that I was talking about, because the history, of course, continues on. And the major commentator on Chandrakirti was an Indian named Jayananda, who lived in the 12th century. But he wrote a very extensive commentary on Chandrakirti's work. And Jayananda actually traveled to Tibet. He helped translate a lot of the Tibetan text. Even, I think, actually in this text we're using, Dispelling Disputes, I think he was one of the translators. I mean, I don't know if he knew Tibetan, but he helped the Tibetan translator to understand the meaning of it. And in his commentary on Chandrakirti, he presents as Chandrakirti's view, his understanding, that conventionally there's no truth. That conventionally we can't really distinguish between truth and non-truth. We can talk about worldly things as worldly renown, but we can't say it's conventionally established by valid cognition, because he'd say that would imply that it's truly existent. So we can't really have a valid argument, and we can't really have a right or a wrong consciousness. It's just a matter of opinion. Ultimately, none of it exists, and that's what we have to come to. And his text was very popular in Tibet when he first came. This was again in the 12th century. So a lot of Tibetans adopted this view at the time. And this is, Tsongkhapa heavily criticized this. In his major commentary on Chandrakirti called Gomparapsa, which is illuminating the intent. It's recently been translated by Thupten Jinpa. He criticizes Jayananda again and again. Now, again, I should mention, for the most part, he agrees with him. So the parts where he doesn't criticize him, it's probably because he's agreeing with what he said and borrowing his ideas. But on certain points, he's very heavily critical of him, specifically of this point, saying that things can't be established by valid cognition, because he says, this is misunderstanding. Again, it's mixing conventional and ultimate analysis. Now, Tsongkhapa was renowned for having used a lot of Dharmakirti's ideas. Dharmakirti was an Indian logician. And so Tsongkhapa's understanding of Madhyamaka is actually very much informed by Dharmakirti's philosophy, which is much more realist, but gives a much more clear picture of valid cognitions. So really his answer is that conventional truth is not ultimately certifiable. It's not something where I can come back and say, okay, I can absolutely prove that this is true because it's proven by this, which is proven by this, and meets back to something real. However, within the conventional framework, certain things can be said to be right or wrong. So I could say this is a picture of Shiva or a picture of Vishnu. Conventionally, it's a picture of Shiva. I could argue, well, how do I know that? Well, because this person said so, and he's the painter. Or I could say, well, actually more so than that, we all agree, and this is the more important point. What we call Shiva doesn't have to meet back to something ultimately real, because it's something that we agree upon. We agree that Shiva is the one holding a trident, and that's not Vishnu. So if we first of all agreed on that, then you try to argue that it's not Shiva because Shiva doesn't ultimately exist. You're getting outside of the conventional framework. Within our framework that we ourselves have established, then we can talk about what we have established as meaning one thing and meaning something, what we have established as meaning another. But if you try to ask, well, where does it ultimately mean back to? That's when you get to the problem of emptiness. This is then it becomes ultimate analysis, and you find that ultimately none of this is based on anything that was established beyond the conventions that we ourselves established. But then if you try to take that too far and say, well, then the conventions have no meaning whatsoever, then you're mixing the two. So Tsongkhapa says that Jayananda misunderstood. He thought that something being established by valid cognition means it has to be ultimately established, whereas all it really means is that within the particular framework that we're talking about, it's what's generally agreed upon. And generally agreed upon, again, it comes this question of where does it meet back to? But it's something that if we establish a particular rule, that it follows that rule.
Sorry, may I just follow up? Is that okay?
Yes.
Just
okay.
Taking permission. Yeah.
Yeah.
Venerable, not confusing the ultimate with the conventional, but again,
Yes.
like for example, in chapter 9, Bodhisattva Shantideva says that even within yogis, there are different levels of yogis. So we are saying that there are different levels of understandings that exist within convention, and within that there is something which is valid, and there are some which are not valid. So I'm not looking for this valid conventional mind ultimately, but I'm just trying to understand how the philosophy asserts within conventionality that this is a mind analyzing convention and this is valid, and this is not. Like, is there some,
Okay.
you see what I'm saying?
I do what you're saying. So one thing I'd mention, actually, because it's a little bit it's not quite what your point was, but I'd like to just say that when you talk about in chapter 9 of Shantideva, this is actually a disputed point, because Shantideva is another Buddhist philosopher that different people interpret different ways, of course. Now, according to Tsongkhapa, he was a prasangika. He had the same view as Chandrakirti. But it's very clear that some people could have interpreted his verses as saying something very different, because he says very clearly things are only established by worldly renown. They're not established by valid cognition. So, Tsongkhapa understands this when he says valid cognition, he's talking about wisdom analyzing the ultimate. But of course, somebody could take that as meaning something different. And when he says that more advanced yogis overpower less advanced yogis, so Tsongkhapa understands that to mean not in terms of realization. So yes, a Madhyamaka philosopher overpowers the Chaitamatra philosopher in terms of logic. But in terms of, for example, a bodhisattva on the first ground and a bodhisattva on the fifth ground, they have the exact same realization of emptiness. The only difference is that one has more merit and more concentration. So he overpowers the lower one, or I could say she also. He or she overpowers the lower one in terms of their merit accumulation and the force of their mind, not in terms of their realization. But in terms of what you're asking, in terms of what does it mean to be a conventionally valid cognition? Now, first of all, a distinguish from an ultimate analysis, right? So I made that distinction before, that ultimate analysis is seeking to find within the basis of designation what exists, what actually constitutes the thing. Is it findable? Conventional analysis tries to stick within that framework. But then what constitutes a conventionally correct and versus one that is not conventionally correct? And so the definition that generally given is it's incontrovertible. Which means it can't be harmed by another conventional analysis. Now you'd ask, well, doesn't this just become infinite regress? And in some sense, yes, because ultimately you can't really get to a point where you say that's the ultimate truth. That's the whole point of it. But in general, if we agree upon what we agree as correct and incorrect, then within that framework, we can say this one is incontrovertible, meaning that another valid cognition can't contradict it. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So we can do the prayers now. If people have other questions, I'd be happy to continue, but I don't want to have people feel that we're going over time. So if anyone has anything important, if you'd like to ask, otherwise we can continue tomorrow.
There are no questions on YouTube.
Okay.
As of now.
So let's do the prayers then, and of course we'll have more time for question and answer. And as you saw on the way this was advertised, that we will do today and tomorrow and next week, but there's no limit, so we'll see how things go. You shouldn't feel we have to rush through it. And if we don't finish next week, we can continue. And of course, if you're not able to participate every time, that's perfectly fine. You can watch recordings also. So we'll just see how things go. And if there's more, if you have questions that don't get answered, even at the end, we can do extra question and answer time. So tomorrow we'll begin again with these two other introductory topics about philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, and then begin with the actual text. So let's do the prayers. I was thinking we could do the prayers that Lama Zopa Rinpoche has recommended for COVID-19 crisis, because many people are still suffering a lot from this. So let's make these dedications. May the precious supreme bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. Samsara and nirvana lack even an atom of inherent existence, and cause and effect independent arising are unbetraying. I seek your blessings to discern the meaning of Nagarjuna's thought. These two are mutually complementary and not contradictory. However many sick sentient beings there are, may they quickly be freed from all sicknesses. May all sicknesses without exception of transmigratory beings never occur again. In all my lives never separated from perfect gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma. And by completing the qualities of the grounds and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Ajadara. By the force of the victorious one Tsongkhapa, acting as my direct Mahayana virtuous friend in all my lives, may I never turn away for even a second from the pure path highly admired by the victorious ones. May I and all sentient beings be able to meet the teachings of the victorious one Losang Dragpa, who lived an eminent life endowed with pure morality, a brave heart in doing the Bodhisattva's extensive deeds, and the yoga of the two stages, the supreme transcendental wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness. Just like the earth, water, fire, and wind, medicines and wood in the forest, may I always be enjoyed by all sentient beings as I like and without resistance. May I hold sentient beings as dear as my life. May sentient beings hold me most dear. May all their negative karma ripen on me, and may all my virtue ripen on them. And by merely, just go up a bit, Shanti, we missed one verse. Shanti, okay. By merely seeing, hearing, thinking about or remembering me, as well as by touching or talking, oh, sorry. Actually, we missed this one too, sorry. The very first one here. May I become like a wish-granting jewel, fulfilling all the wishes, and like a wish-granting tree, fulfilling all the hopes of sentient beings. As long as any sentient being has not been liberated from samsara, may I abide in samsara to help them, even though I achieve highest enlightenment. And again, may I become like a wish-granting jewel, fulfilling all the wishes, and all like a wish-granting tree, fulfilling all the hopes of transmigratory beings. By merely seeing, hearing, thinking about, or remembering me, as well as by touching or talking to me, may all suffering instantly be pacified, and may there be happiness forever. Due to all the past, present, and future merits collected by me, by the numberless Buddhas and numberless sentient beings, which are empty, completely empty, existing from their own side, may I, who am completely empty, existing from my own side, achieve the state of full enlightenment, which is completely empty of existing from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are completely empty of existing from their own side to that state which is completely empty of existing from its own side, and myself alone, who are completely empty of existing from my own side. I fully dedicate all these roots of virtue to be able to train just like the hero Manjushri, who knows reality, and just like Samandra Bhatta as well. I'll fully dedicate all my roots of virtue with the dedication praise of the best, all the gone beyond victorious ones the 3 times that did to have good conduct. May, for the Dharma King Tsongkhapa's way of Dharma to flourish, may all signs of obstacles be pacified, and may conducive conditions be complete. Due to the 3 times heights of merit of the 3 times of myself and others, may the teachings of the victorious one, Losang Drakpa, shine resplendent forever. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gache, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, may you have a long life and your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjuna's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 sublime ones, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Okay, thank you all very much, and we'll see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you.